and welcome to The Fifth Element, a podcast for language educators who are curious, reflective, and eager to bridge the gap between classroom practice and what research tells us about language learning. My name is Jasenka, and I'll be your host on this journey through ideas that shape the future of language education. If you're someone who enjoys geeking out over pedagogy, exploring new teaching methods, or just wondering why we do what we do in the language classroom, you're in the right place. So, what is the fifth element? Well, for years, language teaching has revolved around the four core skills: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. But we believe there's something more, a space for reflection, theory, community, and transformation. That's the fifth element. In each episode, we'll sit down with leading researchers, innovative teachers, and thought leaders in language education. We'll talk about the real stuff, from curriculum design and second language acquisition to inclusion assessment and the challenges of everyday classroom life. We'll ask the not so very hard questions. How explicit should grammar instruction be? Is task-based language teaching just a buzzword or a game changer? And what can research really offer to teachers who are just trying to get through Tuesday? Most of all, this podcast is about building a community, a space for thoughtful conversation, critical questions, and a little bit of inspiration. So whether you're a new teacher, a seasoned practitioner, a graduate student, or just someone who believes in the power of language education, we're glad you're here. This is the fifth element, and we're just getting started. So let's talk. Welcome back to The Fifth Element, the podcast where we explore what lies beyond the four skills of language learning and teaching. Today we have an insightful and engaging conversation with Dr. Lara Bryfonski, an incredible researcher, educator, and an advocate for evidence-based language teaching. If you've ever wondered how research can truly impact the classroom or why task-based language teaching remains such a challenge to implement, this episode is for you. What makes this conversation even more special is Lara herself. So without further ado, let's get to it.
So I'm from the U.S. I live in Washington, D.C., and I come from a teaching background to the research world of language learning and teaching. So I studied to be an ESL teacher, actually high school age, and I originally got my certification in Massachusetts State to teach high school ESL students. Mostly recently immigrated students from Latin America were in this high school. And that's where I got my kind of foundational training in teaching and kind of the joys and challenges of being in the classroom. And then I moved to Central America for several years, where I worked with an organization called BECA, Bilingual Education for Central America. And I worked in a bilingual school there where I was teaching English to second graders, so a completely different age and proficiency population for English learning. Yeah. And I was there kind of in the classroom, really living the experience of watching, children develop their language skills, develop their literacy skills in real time. And I just could not get all of the questions about the issues they were facing, why sometimes my feedback made a difference and other days it didn't make a difference, why certain activities seem to go super well and others seem to completely flop. And I knew from my, early undergrad years that there were people out there that researched this as their full-time jobs. So that's what got me from the teaching world into the language research and teaching research world. So now I'm doing that full-time at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and kind of experiencing how to systematically look at those questions that I faced when I was a classroom teacher myself.
Amazing. And what about this great divide between research and practice? What does research have to say about teaching, and what does actually teaching have to say about the effectiveness of the current research in SLA? Let's have a listen to what Lara has to say about this.
Yeah, it's such a great question, and it's actually an area that I think a lot of people are talking about in earnest right now in the research world, because I completely agree with you. There is certainly a gap where, and in some cases, I think it's a fine gap. I mean, sometimes scientists explore topics for the benefit of science, for knowing how humans acquire languages later in life or in classrooms from a scientific perspective.
Yeah.
I think it's always important to consider pedagogical implications, but maybe not everything always has them.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, a lot of us, including myself, who are interested in real classrooms, we do want to research things that are going to be beneficial and useful for practical use in classrooms. And luckily, a lot of us do come from teaching backgrounds. So we are approaching this like I am, like I know you do, and many of my colleagues, from having taught ourselves or are currently teaching in some cases. So at universities, oftentimes we're teaching language classes at the same time we're researching. Now, the reality, though, is that a lot of times researchers run into the issue of trying to design experiments where they can examine specific variables under certain conditions, and those conditions have to be tightly controlled in order to do the experiment. And the reality of language classrooms is there's no tightly controlling of variables. You've got who you've got, and there's learners at all levels, and there's learners of different backgrounds and motivation all coming together, and you have to navigate all those variables at one time. So I do think that contributes, is that oftentimes research is really isolated because it has to be on very specific things, and it makes it harder to extract the pedagogical implications. And that's really on us researchers. We need to do a better job, and I think, like I said, people are working on this now to talk about research in a way that's accessible to teachers, and also to ask teachers more what issues they're facing and how research can contribute to them. So I think going forward, hopefully we will continue to, work in partnership rather than there being such a gap. Resources you have access to and all of these factors. However, we can tell you generalizations about how people tend to learn languages, summaries of what many different researchers have found doing similar types of studies over and over again, and also where those outcomes can take you and where they cannot, so that teachers know that they can rely on some information, but also rely on their own intuitions, and that's completely fine. I have a book, The Art and Science of Language Teaching, which is with Allison Mackey, and we, I think, tried to show that by having a section that says what the research says, and then what the research does not say about every topic, to recognize the fact that we don't have all the answers, and teachers can and should use their best intuition in cases where there's no other good explanation, or if they feel something works better for their students.
Okay, if you had, a magic wand, and if you could make your research tell you the answer to one specific question related to research, what would that, to language teaching, what would that be?
Ooh, that's such a fun question. Well, maybe I will bring us to the topic of task-based language teaching to talk about this. This is a passion of mine, and I find it very fun to talk with teachers about it, because it's usually a slight change of mindset in how a lesson is designed and how it plays out in a language classroom, which takes grammar and kind of flips it from the beginning to as part of a task or at the end of a task when we're doing something interactive in the classroom. And the reality is, going back to this gap issue, we don't have too many good studies that have compared different approaches and really had strong quantitative evidence that there's any better or best way to teach. I do think that it would be useful to have more controlled studies that compare different types of tasks, ones that have more grammar focus, ones that have less, with different populations of learners, high proficiency, low proficiency, young learners, older learners, and have the answers to how different interactive activities best match those populations. Now, the reality is that what I think teachers would do with that information is they would do exactly what they're doing now, which is use the methods that, not just one method because they are a fan of it, but usually everyone is an eclectic user of different approaches to language teaching, depending on the content and the situation. But I do think having more information about those choices would be useful, and I don't really think that we have great evidence necessarily about that right now, because it's very difficult to research. In general, a task should be related to some real-world use for the language. So why would we be doing this? Would we ever get the chance to actually use our language in a similar way?
Yeah.
And I think that speaks to the issue that a lot of language learners have faced. I certainly faced this. I studied French growing up, and years, middle school, high school, college even. I was a French minor, and when I went abroad, studied abroad in Paris, I felt like I could read a book, l'étranger perhaps, but I could not even understand when someone responded to a question in the market about what vegetables were which. So I had the practical use for my language was never deeply explored in my language classes.
Yeah.
More specifically, we do tasks that help learners focus on meaning making. And function as meaning makers and communicators rather than just taking in explicit, like my teacher said I have to use the subjunctive 3 times. Now I'm going to do an activity where I regurgitate the subjunctive as many times as they said to. In some cases, maybe that's useful if you want to really focus on explicit memory. But what happens is that for a lot of people, and I do think that was me, we memorize things for our tests and we forget them. We never really integrated our language in a way that we could use it fluently because we never were focused on meaning making. We were just focused on being language learners.
Yeah.
So a task would be focused on meaning. You would ask learners to use their language creatively rather than giving them a set of words or grammar that they have to use.
Yeah.
And you would also hopefully incite them to do something with the language in the task. So overcome a gap is usually how we describe this. I have to get information from someone else, and I feel this motivation to communicate for that reason. So overcoming a gap, having people communicate via meaningful ways, using language creatively in a real-world scenario, those are places where we see language acquisition that is durable rather than something that someone can just regurgitate successfully on a grammar test.
Yeah. Okay. That was great. Thank you. And what I always remember is that famous task by Skin and Foster. So sending somebody home to turn off the oven, right? So if you imagined that you're now in school and you had to cook, before you went to school and you forgot to turn off the oven and your only solution is to send your friend home, right?
Yes.
To turn off the oven. How will you explain to that friend where he needs to go, how he can get there, what he needs to do, where is the oven? So where does it turn on or off in this sense? So this is actually an example of a task that makes everybody laugh. And 3, there are so many specific vocab items that you need to actually know in order to be able to explain to that person where he or she needs to go. Now, from my perspective, when I was looking at that task, I thought to myself, wow, this is super logical and super easy. But then on the other hand, how difficult is it to design a task like that? So how do we go around designing tasks, especially for young learners?
I think you bring up such an important point, and this is why I'm really passionate about teacher training, because I think that a lot of teachers want to do innovative things like this and make their classrooms more real-world accessible, regardless of the age of the learners, because it's really motivating when absolutely. People are, even kids, if they're doing something, this is the kind of thing I already like to do or I would like to do, you're going to motivate them better. But teachers don't get a lot of training in going through this exercise that you just described. Okay, how do I take this real world example and make it something pedagogical or applicable to my students? And so that is something that I do in my work now, is I work with teachers to practice this so that we can employ these in our classrooms because that's what you need. You need to practice that skill. It doesn't just appear, like you said, from the sky or out of nowhere.
Yeah.
So usually there are a lot of ways, a lot of variables that I bring up when I talk about this case of younger learners with teachers. And usually proficiency is a question too. So are they young but higher proficiency? That would matter. But let's just say that they're young and lower proficiency as well, because that's usually what's going on.
Yeah.
Usually we suggest that we do more input-based tasks where the learners are taking in information and trying to interpret it, but they don't need to produce as much. That works both for lower proficiency and for younger learners. So having to point to things is an example based on input from a teacher or from some other source, like a video. And also by simplifying, by reducing the number of elements. So in the example of the oven on fire, there's so many different steps that need to be taken. But we could really break those down into very small pieces. So just identifying something that is lost would be similar, right? I need something and I need to tell someone about it. So, and then the direction giving part of that is its own piece. And then kind of like manual directions of manipulating an object is its own piece. So you can imagine breaking this into very simple components that are done over maybe weeks with very young learners that are a series of fun different games. Obviously, we would change the topic to something that matters to them. Maybe I lost my soccer ball at recess on the field, and I need my friend to help me find it. Something like that where they're going to be more connected to that scenario. So connecting to their real world, needs and motivations for younger learners, making things more input-based, simplifying by removing elements and breaking things into smaller steps. This can all take you to the same goal that you would get to if you did it with older learners. Yes.
Okay, so that's
and then you can move up in the complexity slowly as you go, just as your intuition as a teacher would probably tell you. Now, the thing that's interesting with kids, which a lot of people don't realize, because people say, well, kids, they just learn languages so easily, absorb language like a sponge, right? That's what you always hear people saying.
Yeah.
Well, they don't. People, I think, don't. I'm sure language teachers have an intuition about this, of course, but the reality of acquisition at different ages is a little bit messier than just kids are great and adults are bad, right? Because adults, we want to move faster because we have a lot of complicated things we want to say, and we know we want to say those things. We can also sit down and study. So we have all of these skills from being adults with, developed brains to sit down and take in information in an explicit way that kids would not be able to do. Kids also move slower. I mean, if you think about a baby learning their first language, you start with one word and then two words. And then, this is development that is slowly happening over a long period of time before kids are saying that one day I wish that I could be, using these complicated phrases with subordination and all these things. So I think that people, can realize with young kids that development can look a little bit different than it would for an adult who's trying to learn a language that is trying to, that scenario, they could probably understand it and move through the pieces in a different time frame than a young learner would. And with young learners, we can really stretch this out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that a logical continuation of this thought would be individual differences between the learners. You might have a learner who is already, well, let's just say impressively advanced and might engage in very serious discussions about why he lacked sleep last night, right? Or know vocabulary that his peers would not even dream of knowing. But then again, within the same classroom, you have another student who is not that advanced, and they both get the same task. So how do we go about tasks and students with very different stages of acquisition, let's say?
I think that this is such an important point to discuss, and I completely empathize. When I was teaching, I had a student that literally never spoke the entire year and a student that would not stop talking. in the same classroom, right? It's, that's just one example of the many differences that you would find within a classroom, right? And obviously those two students are going to approach language learning from very different places. So I think that differentiation, just like we do in normal, regular content education, is applicable here in language teaching as well. One thing that, speaking of younger kids, although I really do think you could do this with any age, is working in centers, is what we would call it. Some people call them stations, right, where students are rotating around different activities, and one of them is a teacher-led one, and the other are independent. And that really gives the teacher the opportunity to scaffold the activity differently based on the learners in that group, if they've grouped them in a particular way. And I think that depending on what your aim is, so you might adjust an activity to support learners that have less willingness to communicate, that are shyer or lower proficiency than you would for a group that has a really high willingness to communicate, that's very talkative, that doesn't need a lot of push to chat. And so you could do that through scaffolding, through sentence starters, through more visuals and manipulatives to get them get engaged. There's a lot of ways to do it. And you can think about lots of different ways that you could group learners. So that was an example for willingness to communicate, but we also might do it for learners that have higher literacy skills, which is those that are still developing their reading skills. That can really change how you would approach a task. You might also just have some learners that are really high aptitude. So they seem to pick things up very quickly. They can recognize patterns really easily. I always say that I don't think I'm a particularly high aptitude language learner myself, but I'm very talkative. So I have a lot of fluency, but I will pay attention less to grammatical accuracy and complexity when I speak my second languages. So a teacher who recognizes that in me might want to design tasks that push me to focus on my grammaticality or my accuracy, knowing that I will talk and talk, but maybe make lots and lots of errors. And there are a lot of ways to do that. One of my favorite examples of this is the fact of telling someone that they're going to have to present after giving them an activity versus not telling them, and then asking everyone to present just in the moment. We see in research changes the kind of output that you would get. So if you tell people, okay, you're going to do this task, and then you're going to present on what your group found, people will tend to focus more on being accurate or complex in their language because they've gotten time to plan and they know it's coming. That will be completely different if you have your students do an activity and then the activity ends and then you turn to one group and say, okay, what can you tell us all what you did in your activity? And you haven't prepared them. Now you're prioritizing fluency. They haven't had time to prepare, so they're just going to have to be fluent. And you will probably hear more errors. But there are times when you want that, right? You want them to just be fluent, or you want them to be more accurate. So these small changes to a lesson design can have big implications.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah, I mean, there are so many things that went through my mind while you were explaining this. And one of them was, I think, and the most important one was this focus on form and accuracy and how it actually connects with TBLT.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think it's a really common misconception about communicative approaches like TBLT, and communicative approaches is really an umbrella that a lot of different approaches fall into: project-based, content and language integrated teaching. There are a few. TBLT has this very specific definition for tasks and the way that tasks are designed, but they're compatible with other teaching approaches. But there's this conception that I've heard from people before too that, well, you don't teach grammar then, and my students need to be taught grammar. It is actually a misconception, because the communicative approaches are really in the middle of a spectrum between grammar focus, like a Latin class where we're just translating back and forth, and an immersion context where you are just maybe like wandering around the country studying abroad and you're not taking any classes and you're just taking in whatever you get and trying your best. Communicative approaches like TBLT take both of those together. So TBLT would have grammar and vocabulary development built in. The difference is the timing of when it occurs. So a traditional kind of approach would be, I tell you about the grammar point of today. I do some sort of maybe direct instruction about it, and then you get to practice it and then you are expected that you'll be able to kind of perform on that grammar point. So in TBLT, we in a traditional way might use an interactive task to do that, but they will still front the grammar teaching. And in TBLT, we bring in the grammar points and the vocabulary either during or after the task so that learners are better able to form those meaningful connections between the forms they're encountering and why they would be needed and useful. So it's not ignored. And the next time they do the task, they'll have had that, grammatical experience in a real life task situation that hopefully they'll be able to apply later. And repeating task is one way to do that. But it certainly is not the case that form is ignored. It's just not the main focus of how we organize a task-based curriculum. I do think that there is a bias that everyone has that's totally understandable and natural of that we teach the way that we maybe ourselves were taught or learned. And because TBLT is a bit newer on the scene than, very traditional approaches, there is kind of this bias, I think, towards that, especially if you found it effective for you. Of course, you would want to do what you thought was most effective. Yeah. So the reason why I'm interested in the science of language acquisition is to make generalizations. So yes, that could be effective for one person or another person, but we want to know what the majority is going to gain. And we know that a lot of people go through language classes and they leave without basic fluency. Yeah. So we know this is an issue. So I do think that I should do what I learned through my own education. We call that the apprenticeship of observation. So you yourself have been a learner for so many years that you take in all of this apprenticeship from what you saw. Now, I think that this is also a failure of researchers to be better communicators to the teaching world, because I do see other approaches that have gotten a lot of popularity, even traditionally older approaches like comprehensible input. Yeah. And I don't mean that just like what comprehensible input means itself, but like the world of CI teaching is something that you hear talked a lot about kind of in teacher circles, which is great. I think that, there have been a lot of resources that people have made and branded them as like CI resources, and a lot of workshops and trainings, and there's been a lot of outreach. And then you get a movement of people that identify as this type of teacher. And TBLT has not been the same way. And I do think one issue, and I don't have the answer for that, is that a lot of teachers seek specific resources, like maybe like textbooks. Yeah. And TBLT is kind of not, I think it's compatible if you have to use a textbook with your curriculum. There's ways that you can adapt the activities to make them more task-like, and that's something I do in my training. But it's not a monetizable approach to language teaching. Like, no one person can write a textbook and say everyone could use this one textbook about TBLT, which is something I like about it. Like, it's kind of like eschewing the capitalism that kind of comes along with a lot of different teaching strategies where they can become real money makers. In a sense, TBLT, is not ever going to have a textbook that every student would have in their hands in a whole school district. So we have to find ways to get the information out without it being a textbook that's just, you can just say, oh, just buy that and just do it. Do what it says in the textbook. I think that it's going to be much more tailored than that. So the outreach on the part of researchers communicating with teachers needs to be there.
Yeah, absolutely. As you were actually saying this, I remembered how you said, okay, it's actually up to every teacher to find a community of like-minded educators who are willing to try something new, who are not, who will not actually stay and teach something that they are aware does not really work, or that they're not actually sure if it works. I really liked how you said that teachers and language educators should actually work towards this community of like-minded educators, right?
I hope so too, yeah. And that's actually how we met. Yeah. So for all of your listeners out there, we connected from my call to say people should get together, researchers and teachers, collaborate, talk about issues that are important to them so that we can move the field forward. And that's how you and I met, and we started kind of our collaboration. Yeah. So it does work. We are evidence of that.
Yeah. Absolutely. And also let's mention the task bank.
Yes. Yeah. So this is from my colleague and friend, Lara Bryfonski at the University of Indiana, and also some of her colleagues who have contributed. It is at tblt.indiana.edu, and it is a free open source bank of resources that have been vetted by peer reviewed by researchers. So anyone can submit a task to the task bank, and then researchers will review it to see, does this align with TBLT as we understand it, and give them feedback if they want to adapt it, if it does not, so that they can still submit it. But you can be sure that you can find task-based resources on this task bank. It's still growing, so I encourage you to get involved if you're interested. Some languages are better represented than others, of course, right now, but you can search by language, and then you can also look to see if there are tasks that you could adapt for your own classroom in the task bank. So it's a really great resource, and it is part of that International Association of TBLT that I mentioned earlier. There's different cognitive skills, different input types, different modalities. So are you someone that has to teach online, or are you teaching face-to-face? Are you trying to get your students to do something with like text chat or use technology? You can filter for those kinds of things in there, which makes it a really fun way to explore how different people are using TBLT around the world.
What an insightful conversation. Lara's work reminds us that research isn't meant to stay locked away in academic journals. It should inform, shape, and inspire what happens in the classroom. From discussing the persistent challenges of implementing TBLT to highlighting the role of communities in supporting both teachers and learners, this episode underscores the need for collaboration between researchers and educators. One of my favorite takeaways, the idea that if we could close just one gap in language education, it should be the disconnect between theory and practice. And Lara's work, both her research and her book, helps us move in that direction. And thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and share it with your fellow educators. And of course, let's keep the conversation going. Reach out, share your thoughts, and let's continue building this community of language professionals.
Thank you so much for having me, and I think we probably could have talked all day, so maybe we'll have a part 2 in the future if people are excited and interested. Yes, thank you for having me.